Great. Okay, so thanks for coming to this experimental remote roundtable for ASEH 2019. This is a session on the development of environmental history scholarly networks with global perspectives from around the world. So we have 4 colleagues here on this roundtable from 4 different countries who will talk a bit about their sort of regional context for how environmental historians have organized and shared knowledge among one another. And then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience there in Columbus. So I'll just quickly have us go around and introduce ourselves, and then we'll present from furthest away from Columbus to closest to Columbus. And so we'll let Professor Han introduce herself, and then Wilko, and then me, and then Claudia.
Okay. Great. Can I begin to introduce myself? Okay, yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Zhaoqing from Center of Historic Geographic Studies, Fudan University of China. It's so great to meet you through internet. Okay.
Hi, I'm Wilko Hardenberg from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and it's a pleasure to meet you all this morning for you and afternoon for me.
And hello, everyone. I'm Kheraj from York University, and I'm the director of the Network in Canadian History and Environment, and I'm joining you from Toronto, Ontario.
Hello, I am Claudia Leal. I am Colombian. I work at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, but I am calling in from Chapel Hill. I am at the National Humanities Center right now.
So Claudia turned out to actually be the closest to the conference in the end. Okay, so we're gonna each give maybe 5 to 7 minute brief presentation before we open up the floor to questions and discussion for the roundtable. And we'll let Professor Han start us off.
Okay, yeah. So actually my presentation will basically based on the questions Sean raised to us maybe 1 month ago. Yeah. For the first question, how have environmental history scholars in your region managed linguistic differences in networking? For this question, I don't think it's a problem at all in China. Although there are 4 language families in China, the majority of Chinese speak Mandarin and its 7 relatives, which are referred to as Chinese. As you know, we are all educated in Mandarin since we are very, very young. As a result, most literate people can speak Mandarin. So we usually communicate with people from other provinces or regions in Mandarin in our daily life. Besides, after China was the first united politically 2,000 years ago, it has only one single writing system from then on. We write in Chinese characters. For some autonomous regions like Xinjiang, we were autonomous regions, we do encourage bilingual education. However, Chinese is still a compulsory language for their education. So this is another question for us, for our communication. For the second question, what are some of the current topics of interest in environmental history among scholars in my region? As you know, both historic geography and environmental history concern the relationship between human being and its environment. So they are closely linked with each other, especially in China. We have a very strong background for historic geographic studies. So, so actually, this is a traditional topics. I mean, historic geography study is a very, very traditional topics for us. But nowadays, except for topics of historic geography, we also have other new topics such as the migration of flora and fauna, a theory and method of environmental history studies, some other topics like people's knowledge and perception on nature in the past, and also history of epidemic diseases, and also history of marine environment. This is kind of very new topic for us. And for the third question, are there sub-regional variation in environmental expertise in my region of the world? I think yes, of course. Firstly, as researchers are from a very broad range of disciplines such as historic geography, world history, agricultural history, economic history, and social history, their academic background will have impact on their research objects and method. Secondly, as they are from different provinces and regions, the different local natural environmental condition and the social development also will exert influence on their research topics. Thirdly, the scholars are also from different institutes, and each institute has different research topics and projects. I can give you some example. For example, scholars like from Yunnan University, which located in southwest part of China, they will choose Yunnan province or the southwest part of China as they study as their research priority areas. The theme will range from climate change in Yungui Plateau to the study of ethno-ecology, since Yunnan is one of the provinces many ethnic minorities inhabit. So, where scholars from Northwest Shanxi Normal University will put the land cover and land use change of Loess Plateau as their research theme. For my university, most scholars would like to choose the lower Yangtze River as their main research region, for it's convenient for us to do field investigation. So as a result, there are huge sub-regional variation in environmental history in China, the study in China. For the last question, how do scholars in your region integrate to work with foreign scholars who study your region? Actually, there is a variety of ways to work with foreign scholars, such as co-organizing conference is quite frequently applied. Short-term visiting scholar program is also a very good way. As far as I know, the Center for Ecological History of Renmin University of China in Beijing has set up a very good example. It has begun cooperation with Carson Center at LMU since 2012. In addition to regular conferences organized by both sides, the non-scheduled exchanges between the scholars are quite often. They also co-edit to publish a journal named World Environment and Carson Perspectives. So that's all for my presentation. Very short presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. We'll turn it over to Wilko now.
Yes, hi. So I won't go so orderly about every single question. I will take a rougher approach to this. But the first thing I want to say relates very much to the first question that Professor Han just mentioned. And I think the language differences in Europe are a main issue of networking within Europe. It's a multilingual setting. We don't have a common language. We don't have a common way of writing. We don't even have a common alphabet in the widest sense. English helps out wide and bright and contributes to being able to hold every 2 years ASEH conference in different places around Europe. But the other thing that the European Society for Environmental History has set up is that it's constituted in regional groups with regional representatives, which help to bring the voice of the European level society at the local level and interact with a number of quite a few local regional societies. There is one in Spain, there is one in France, there is a pretty solid group in Turkey now, which is borderline Europe from many points of view. There is a new group from Israel, which also is on the border. European Society for Environmental History goes way outside of Europe, so it's hard to tell where I should run the limit here, because we have a representative for Australia, and one for South Africa. That's how European it goes. But I'll try to stick to Europe as a continent, and not the EU and not ASEH boundaries. So the regional representative issue and the language issue, I think, are crucial. It's, I think, a very good way to interact and to have to bring in people who are very versed in English. We have a prize for dissertations, which is open to any language, and in which you can present. And this brings also up, we had a long discussion about how to structure this, because one issue is ours a society of European environmental history as environmental history about Europe, or is it a society of Europeans doing environmental history? And I think it's both. So we ended up saying you can present any work of environmental history as long as you work at a European institution, or you can present any work on European environmental history if you work at any institution in the world. Because that's what it is about. It's about bringing together both the people who do environmental history in Europe and bring together all the people who do European environmental history. So this leads to the question about, so what was the fourth question, how do we interact with scholars from around the world? I don't think this is a problem at all from a European point of view. We welcome anybody. I see Marcus in the audience. He is American as far as I can tell. But he is a very active member of the European Society of Environmental History. And there are plenty of Northern Americans doing European environmental history and many Europeans doing American environmental history. So I think it's a very porous border here between ESEH and ASEH from that point of view. The point about what are some of the more current topics in European environmental history, I think, is unanswerable. Anything you can think of, look at the program of the ASEH. Probably it's the same topics you will find in the program of the ESEH. There are some national specialties. Historical geography is very common in Eastern Europe. Agricultural history is very common in Southern Europe. So it's very hard to say something from a common general European point of view. But another thing we are working on is to help to share better what we work on, to become also a hub for open access as a European Society for Environmental History. So there is a lot of our work being published on sites like academia.edu or ResearchGate, which are using what we publish to make money. So we were thinking and working on, as soon as I have time, to set up a group on H Commons, which is the repository of the MLA, the Modern Language Association, and which would allow to make these material freely available from the people who want to make them available, and also in a setting that does not bring or lead to the information about ourselves to be accessed by a commercial company, and also to be them really freely available, because you don't need to be a member of the group to access. You will not need to be a member of the group to access the material. So, and you will not need compelled to become member of a social media hub. I think this is, as a start for the discussion, should be enough, and I will pass on to Sean then.
Okay, thank you, Wilko. So I'll go up next here and talk a little bit about Canada and the experience of organizing environmental historians in Canada. So I've been the director of the Network in Canadian History and Environment since 2015. This is the largest scholarly network of environmental historians and historical geographers who work in Canada but study both Canada and anywhere else in the world. So it sounds very similar to what Wilko was saying about the ESEH, where we have colleagues who are members of Niche who study Canada, but also Latin America, Europe, etc. And then we also have Niche members from outside of Canada who study Canada itself. So there's some similarity there to ESEH. Niche as an organization was founded in 2004 by Alan McEachern, who I think is that tiny head in the back of the room that I can see. There he is, okay. Who won a fairly substantial grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to develop a scholarly research network specifically focused on what we call knowledge mobilization, or the dissemination of research findings and facilitating engagement among scholars in a particular field. So from the beginning, Niche used the internet and internet networking to fulfill its mission of trying to connect historical geographers and environmental historians across the country. It began with a website joined with a collaborative communication tool called Groove Networks, which, if anybody remembers what this was before it was purchased by Microsoft, it was a real precursor to some of the collaborative networking tools that we use today, like Google Docs, or some of the new workplace chat software like Slack or Basecamp. And it was a way for developing virtual peer groups for discussion about issues in environmental history, or for workshopping papers. In 2007, Niche redeveloped its website for Web 2.0 on the Drupal platform to allow for user-generated content, which allowed members to start to write content for the website and to comment on content that was published on the website. And this was what would become the beginning of blogging for Niche, and that has grown into a much larger component of what we do online now. In 2012, 2013, we migrated the website over to WordPress, which was a more deliberately focused blogging platform that has led to an expansion of the user-generated content on the website, facilitating opportunities for members to be able to write and share their writing with others, and allowing us to expand into video and podcasting through the website. So Niche has made use of a variety of internet-based tools, primarily through the hub of our website to connect scholars across the country. But we've also used a number of different tools for smaller group organization, like Google Groups, Skype, and Google Hangouts for virtual meetings and virtual discussion groups. This has been relatively successful, I think, in the Canadian context for fostering environmental history scholarship in the country, in part for geographic reasons. Environmental historians in Canada tend to be thinly and widely dispersed across a vast geography. There are small pockets of environmental history scholars, mainly based in our large urban centers across the country and across numerous time zones. There are concentrations of environmental historians in Vancouver, in Saskatoon, in Toronto, in the Southern Ontario area. And so having an online network to connect all of those scholars, I think, was part of the key to developing the field in Canada, and to help break the isolation of those scholars from one to the next. So often environmental historians may be one of only 2 or 3 other environmental historians at their universities, and Niche was able to use online networking to build a larger critical mass among those scholars who were spread out so widely. There have been some efforts to try and bridge the linguistic divide in Canada in Niche between Anglophones and Francophones, which are the 2 predominant settler languages in Canada. But this continues to be a challenge for Niche, as it is in the broader field of Canadian history, where Anglophone scholarship and Francophone scholarship tend to run parallel but not interconnect very often. And so our French language content on the Niche website has been spotty or intermittent, and it's not, it's never been as well integrated as perhaps that we want, but that's a reflection of scholarship and historical scholarship in Canada generally. Niche has no annual conference. Instead, we hold an annual summer school, which is started in 2006, called the Canadian History and Environment Summer School, or Summer Symposium. We bring together between 30 and 50 graduate students and faculty members from across the country and from outside the country for 2.5 days of activities, which are often a combination of talks, discussion groups, and field trips. And they're located across the country from year to year. So this year we're holding it in Vancouver. Last year we were in Saskatchewan. And it's the one event that brings people face-to-face together. We also have an annual business group meeting, which is part of the Canadian Historical Association. So environmental historians as a subfield of history meet just for a lunch meeting at the Canadian Historical Association annual meeting. But environmental history in Canada is tended to organize and develop in parallel to the National Historical Association rather than being a subgroup within it, which is a distinction from some of the other subfields of history in Canada. And we have a number of, ad hoc events and activities across the country. So there are regional groups that organize reading groups in different cities and different provinces in Canada. And finally, we've got a bunch of publication outputs that have come out as a result of this networking through niche. So there's an edited collection series that's published by the University of Calgary Press. We now publish a peer-reviewed occasional research paper series on our website called Papers in Canadian History and Environment. We have a book review publication, a podcast, and our regular blog, which we've been publishing for several years. And most recently, we've been collecting those blog articles now into ebook anthologies and republishing them as ebooks. So the niche website over the years has kind of emerged as a significant web publication platform for environmental history research in Canada. So lastly, the future for environmental history networking in Canada has some possibilities, but I don't know exactly where it's going to go. There's no Canadian Society for Environmental History. Niche is the closest thing to it, but it's not a formal scholarly association. So we're starting to have discussions around whether or not Niche needs to evolve into a scholarly association with membership fees and an elected governance structure. Discussions also about whether or not there should be a conference, broaden out that summer school into something larger. And then, of course, the possibilities for the expansion of our publishing capacity. All of these potential options for environmental history networking in Canada are contingent or dependent upon the scale of the field in Canada, which, as I said, tends to be smaller and geographically dispersed, which I think throughout the history of niche and its organization has been the challenge for organizing a subfield in a place like Canada. And I'll turn it over to Claudia now.
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here comfortable in my office and seeing you all in Columbus. I've got a spiel that it's a little bit different. I wanted to introduce Solcha to you since you might not know about it, and then talk a little bit about the big challenge, the one big challenge that I feel our field has. Solcha is a loosely tied network of both people in Latin America, as well as Americans and people from Spain that started to form in 2003 and gets together every 2 years. Our next meeting is in Quito next year. We started to have other kinds of activities, mainly two big ones. If I am right, Regina's right at the audience. And Regina started in 2012, our biggest project, which was our journal, ALAC, that we still have. And then the following year, in 2013, we started the graduate school that we're going to be holding our fourth session or meeting, our school, this year at Stanford in the month of November. We have a board that runs our society, and initially we had an organization very similar to what Wilko was describing for ASEH. We had regional representation. But we ran into a problem. We had a lot of people who were sitting on the board who really didn't do much. And on the other hand, we had a bunch of people who were actively working for the network, but were not part of the board or the system of governance that we had. So we decided to change our board, and now people on the board have concrete responsibilities. So the vice president is the person who's organizing the conference. The president is the person who organized the previous conference. The secretary is in charge of what all secretaries need to do, which is keep minutes and stuff like that. But in our board, we also have the person who's in charge of the journal, the person who's in charge of communications and things of that sort. We do not have a treasurer because Solcha does not have money. We don't have membership. So the only moment in which you're dealing with money, it's when we're organizing conference, and then each organizer kind of stands on his or her own. Solcha, I would say, has a very unequal, a lot of sub-regional variations. So Brazil really is about half of Solcha. They are by far the strongest group. They really were organized. They're very productive. There are other communities that are more or less strong, like that in my country, Colombia, or the one in Costa Rica, and there are other ones like that in Mexico, where you have several people doing environmental history, but rather disconnected, or spots like the Southern Cone, where there are relatively few people doing environmental history, or places like Venezuela, where we have no one. So I guess one of the challenges that we're facing is making sure that environmental history is stronger in those places where it's weaker now, and that it's better integrated to our network. But now I'm going to change to what I see as the biggest challenge that Solcha has been contributing to solve, but that we still face, and I would call that insularity. Solcha has been very useful in bringing people together and allowing people who are used to talking to those who are very close to them. And what I'm saying here is people in Latin America tend to write and speak to national audiences, and very often even to regional and sub-regional within the country. So people in Antioquia within Colombia will talk to other Antioqueños. People in the south of Brazil will write about topics that are important in the south of Brazil and talk largely to people who are also in the south of Brazil. So I think Solcha has been very important in allowing those groups to talk and share their insights and their findings with a broader audience. ALAC has been very important, and I think in general the way our journals work have helped in that sense, because unlike what happens in the US, all journals in Latin America are open access. But I think the fact that we come together and that we see each other and that we exchange our production has been very important. For example, in the last Solcha meeting, we did a fundraiser for ISO, and all authors brought their books and we sold them to help the scholarships, and that was important not only for raising money for people who needed to go to Florianopolis, but also just to let people know about what we're doing. We have a mailing list in which people tend to post articles, or even send books. We work a lot with pirated copies, so we share a lot of PDFs from our work, and it has been Solcha that has helped the circulation of our work, so that has been very important. But I would say that insularity continues to be a problem, and it continues to be a problem in a different way. And it's really in the way that we tend to see and understand and write and conceive the topics and the problems that we write about. I think largely people from Latin America still frame their problems in a very parochial manner. And I see Solcha as a platform that will help us and will force us to think in a more broader way. If you are from Peru and you want your American colleague and you want your colleague from Costa Rica to understand what you're writing, you have to provide context. You have to frame your questions in a more universal manner, as part of topics and problems that go beyond what's happening in that particular place that you're interested in. And so I think we're moving in that direction, but there's still a lot to do. The fact, for instance, that the prize that we have, the Eleanor Melville Prize, that it's an American prize, and it's awarded by the Conference on Latin American History of the American people who do environmental history. It is open to, books that are published in Latin America and in Spanish and Portuguese can participate. They can be sent to the jury in PDF format, and yet only 8 out of the 10 books that have been that have won this prize have been books published in the US by American scholars. And I think that talks a lot to what I was saying before. I think that we need more Latin American books to win this prize, not for the sake of the prize, but for what it means. What it means to write books that can reach a wider audience, books that will be read not only by people who are interested in that exact particular topic, but people who are interested in Latin American environmental history or just in environmental history in general. And that takes me to two final related challenges. The first one is that I see our network as a way of changing our discipline in this way so that it can do what it really needs to do in the end, what it's the reason for us to work as scholars in Latin America, and is to change our view of the past. Environmental history in Latin America has grown, is getting more recognition. The fact, for instance, that UNAM, that's the National University in Mexico, perhaps the biggest university in Latin America, has just sent out a call for an environmental historian is a sign of that recognition. But I was talking recently to my colleagues for a little article that I wrote who teach survey courses in Colombia and Latin America, and for the most part, they don't incorporate environmental history at all. If you look recent books published on history of Colombia, there was this fabulous reader of the book series of readers, that published sources. There was not one single source on environmental history. So environmental history in Latin America is still marginal. And our biggest challenge is to change the way we understand history, is that we understand that history is not only a human affair. And I think the network, Solcha, is uniquely positioned to strengthen the field, to help the field have this broader view that I've been talking about, so that we can really change history. And a last point that I wanted to do is that one of the big challenges that I see for our network is to connect with people in the global south. We have a very strong relationship with Americans, partly because they're Americans who do Latin American environmental history, partly because some of us studied in the US, like is my case. Weaker ties with Europe, except for the case of Spain, with whom for historical reasons we have very strong ties. But I think, and I'm thinking here of ASEH, it is very important that we talk with people in Africa, that we talk with people in Asia, that we talk with people in India, and also with people in the US and Canada and Europe who are especially the ones thinking more about those regions of the world. Unfortunately, it tends to go through Europe, it tends to go to the US, because that's where the resources are. And that's where this more universal view tends to come from, so to facilitate dialogue. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. And so now we've got plenty of time for questions from the audience, and Melissa's got some questions as well, just to get things going if we need it. But we'll open the floor up to the folks in Columbus to ask their questions about environmental history networking around the world.
Hi, you guys can hear? Okay.
Yes, and if you could just introduce yourself and where you're from so that we know.
My name is Sarah Hamilton. I'm at Auburn University in Alabama. My question is, what can we do from the North American perspective, or from the United States perspective, that can facilitate these networks? Because these sound like fairly specific problems in each of the regions that we're dealing with, and what can we do to kind of make those networks more effective?
Go ahead, Claudia.
Well, I have had the good fortune of being at the Rachel Carson Center and now being at the National Humanities Center with absolutely, fabulous colleagues from whom I've learned a lot. But I've been really shocked by something from my European and American colleagues. And it's their lack of interest of what we do, of, history of Colombia. They couldn't care less. Wilko's hearing me, and he might say that's not true, because Wilko and I edited together a book. And what I see is that we did manage to build, like that's the nature state that Wilko, Matthew Kelly, Emily Wakefield, and I edited together, we did manage to create a very nice dialogue and to transcend those problems. Because, you know, usually when you're from a country like Colombia, even though we tend to be very parochial, once you kind of stick your head a little bit out, you know, if you're from Colombia, you have to look outside, you know, nobody's going to be looking at Colombia. So you're forced to, you want to learn environmental history, then you read the classics from the US and maybe you pick out and look at Brazilians. But I think that if Americans and Europeans had a little bit more interest in the rest of the world, it's very, obviously those who are Americanist, because they're the Latin Americanists, and, you know, with those we have no problem. But I think what would be interesting is having more dialogue with people who do similar things about the US, or about England, or about France, or about Germany. And I feel that tends to be hard. It's very easy to talk to a German person interested in Latin America, but it's very hard to talk to a German person interested in Germany, because it would only happen in their terms. So that's...
I'll say a couple of things about that, because it's an interesting question, at least from a Canadian perspective, because one thing I didn't say in my notes is that we don't have an annual conference, but we kind of do. It's the ASEH, and Canadians kind of glom onto it and do a kind of sub-conference within the ASEH, Canadian Environmental History, which, you know, has its pluses and minuses to it. But one thing I would say that American colleagues could do is participate in the World Congress. So that's the one way you can start to network with colleagues around the world. And when the opportunity arises, if there's a good reason to go to the ESEH, if there's a good reason to collaborate with scholars working in environmental history outside of the country, I think that would be to the benefit, particularly for environmental historians of the United States, to see the interconnections between their topics in a US context and how those same issues are studied in different parts of the world.
I'm muted. Okay, now I'm unmuted. I will add something. I believe I'm partly on the side of those who should do more as Europe and especially Germany. I come from a country with plenty of money, and we should invite more people from other parts of the world than just the usual suspect from the US, which is a tendency my institution in particular is trying to overcome. But what we can do more is, one thing is, when we do peer review, try not always to ask, oh yeah, but what is new about saying it about Colombia? Or what does it give me to know these things about Italy? Which is not a question we usually pose when the same thing is written about the US. Then it's just interesting out of the blue. And this is something that I fear. This is something Europeans also suffer about, this need to justify, or constantly justify, especially from smaller European countries. Germany is a pretty strong one, but if you try to publish something, let's say, about Slovenia, it becomes the hardest thing on earth, because it's very hard to get outside of your borders, and you need to frame it in ways that are with so much intellectual aspects and so much theorization behind it to justify why that case study is exceptional, which is not always the case. It's not exceptional. It's just often it's just interesting on its own, and maybe try to meet on halfway and not always assume that if it's not US, you need to justify why it's interesting.
Okay, we'll open to a new question.
John Samuels has the microphone.
Oh, hi, John.
Hey, how you doing? This is great. Thanks for organizing it. I wanted to say to Claudia's point that I guess having had the Rachel Carson experience of being brought together with a lot of other scholars from all around the world, Claudia is a great example of before I met you and hung out with you in Munich and our kids played together and stuff. I'm much more inclined to read your work and do read your work because of that personal connection. I mean, as we know, there's a tidal wave of work coming out in this field, which is great, but you can't read it all. But when it's people I know from the Carson Center, I step outside my topic areas, I step outside my national frames. And I'm wondering, my question is, to the heart of this experiment, which I think is fantastic, how much do the panelists feel that this kind of electronic networking and workshopping and seeing people's faces, even if it's on screens, can accentuate that, or it can build that kind of networking so that people are able to step a little bit outside their existing networks, and they're able to put a face to an author's name, and then they're more likely again to read that work and broaden themselves. So yeah, I'd like to see to the experiment you're engaged in.
Does anybody want to take that up?
Hi, John. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't know. This is a new experiment, and we'll have to see what comes out of this. But I agree with what you say. I also have the tendency to read the work of the people who I know, no matter what the topic is. And I think that it also depends how we use these platforms. It might be unlikely that some of you who are sitting there see some of us in their screen and immediately goes to look at our work, although that might happen, in the same way that it happens with any panel. When you go to a panel and you hear somebody whose work you like, you might just Google afterwards who that person is, what that person has written, or maybe when you go to the book section, you'll put the name together with the face, and so it might help in the normal way that any a panel presentation helps. But I think that we can move on to another level, and I'm just going to give another example. With Alan McEachern, who's also in the audience, we were part of a jury together. How do you say? We were evaluators together just recently. And so we Skyped and we talked about the prize, but we also talked about, well, it wasn't the prize. We talked about who to give these grants to, but then we also talked about other things. And it wasn't the same as, being in the same room with, a cup of coffee each in our hands, but it was very intimate in another way. You're right in the screen saying this big face and, talking kind of very honestly. And I think that is another way of coming together, making friends. Sure, it's not as strong as, hanging out under the trees whose leaves are falling with your kids and, chatting for an afternoon as we did, but it also counts and it helps and it's way cheaper. So I think we have to think in that it's not only these panels, that there are other ways, but I think that your point of personal connection is fundamental. It's getting not just to know faces, it's getting to know human beings. It's building friendships, it's feeling like warm feelings for people. And that goes on to interest, academic interest. For me, sometimes it's hard to separate the two in a very, good way.
Farina Barker wants to ask a question, and then we'll go to Libby Rana, if that's all right.
Hi, guys. I really appreciate that we're trying to do this here. There are three observations I would like to make. One is, unfortunately, the monetary divide between rich and poor countries is mirrored by the digital divide. So bringing in people who would not be able to afford coming in person has often the same problems as we have when we try this electronically, because of the very bad broadband connections in many countries. The second thing is there is also an issue of how much can you do with countries that actively discourage scholars from international connections. And by actively discouraging, what I mean is I've worked with people in many countries, and if the promotion to an academic position is mainly based on what you do in your local language, and you don't get much credit for doing something in other languages, because basically your peers will be national peers, and these national peers won't read what you've published in English because their English is not good enough. Then you run into another kind of trouble that we haven't at all addressed. And the third thing is, of course, funds as such, because it's getting increasingly difficult to bridge the monetary gap between the rich and the poor countries for scholars. And we're seeing this with the Florianopolis conference. It takes us a lot of effort to get travel funds for people. And we still have people who write to us that they cannot come because they lack the means, and these are university professors. It's just that they don't have the money for it. So for what it's worth, there are things that you can, and there are unfortunately many things that you cannot do with electronic networking. And I have this kind of fear that people will relegate us to say, well, just do it electronically, and then have a reason to gloss over these big problems that even the best internet connection in the world cannot solve. And I just wonder what's your take on that?
Yeah, Wilko.
Yeah, I agree. This will not solve any major problem, and we are still all calling from countries with very good internet connections, and we haven't involved anybody with a very poor connection. And it would have been a problem, and it is a problem to connect. And the only thing we can do is to invest in our institution to fund travel and trips for the people who need to come over and do things. That's the only thing that as a German at a German institution I can try to do, is to fund more people from the global south to come and visit Berlin for longer or shorter periods. But going back but there is also in the European setting something that I did not mention, is there is some of the culture of do your work in your language and you will have a career, do your work in English and you will end up in an Anglosphere, which will not lead you to a job in some European universities. And this is exists also in quite rich or medium rich European countries. And it also leads to the fact that environmental history is in many European countries, even if we have a society and many people doing it, is not a discipline in the sense that you cannot have a chair in environmental history, for example, in a country just like Italy. So you will have to do some history. You will have to be a modern historian and teaching everything, and then do environmental history as your side or as your research job. And this, I think, is pretty common throughout Europe. I think in Germany we have one chair in environmental history, and it's being it's being selected now who will be the next chair, and most of the others are doing regional history, agricultural history, historical geography. So this is a limitation that we also have in Europe, in pretty rich countries, in respect to the number of positions in environmental history that we see coming up in the Anglo-American system.
I don't know if Professor Hahn, if you want to respond or not to the point about whether your institution encourages you to engage in international outreach. I know that you've, been a visiting professor abroad before, but from your perspective in China, are scholars encouraged to internationalize their work?
Okay, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I want to say environmental history, the subject of environmental history is just like a thriving, we just at the beginning of environmental history study now, though it's a very thriving some kind of field. I want to tell you, let me say, the Special Committee of Environmental History was set up in 2015, and the first conference of Chinese environmental history was just held last November in Guangzhou, and now we have maybe more than 300 scholars as a member of environmental history society. And in that conference, we have kind of discussion of this kind of internet communication or something like this, but still we haven't figured out what was going to be done in the future. But for my institute, Yeah. Although you say for most of my colleagues, actually, because we have a very strong background of historic geographic studies, so they cannot kind of not so engaged in environmental history. They always said, "Oh, environmental history, what's that?" Can you understand me? Because they are from historic geography. So actually in my institute, maybe only 3 or 4 scholars like me would like to say, oh, sometimes I'm doing something like related to environmental history. Also in China, before this conference, I called several of my colleagues to ask their situation in their institute. In China, as far as I know, there are at least 6 centers for centers related to environmental history was set up recently. But although there are 6, maybe more than of that, this kind of institution is not real, because maybe there is only one director, but there is no faculties. Can you understand? And also we have no any degree for a graduate degree for like major in environmental history. We still haven't this kind of subject. But so as you know, although some scholars said say I'm doing environmental history, but anyway, the background are from other subjects. No special subject degree for environmental history. How can I say that? So we are just at the beginning. But in the future, I'm optimistic of it. Maybe after today's discussion, maybe I'm thinking of it when you are talking. Maybe I can maybe in the next conference, maybe I can give them some suggestion, like, okay, let's try to build a internet platform like you do in Canada, like Wilko do in Germany, or something like this. Maybe someday we can, with our effort, maybe we can find we can try to build an institution like Carson Center. In some, we can find this. We can maybe find some university who would like to build up this kind of institution, and so we can maybe maybe we can find some fund to support people from all the world, especially nowadays from Africa. You see, now they try to develop a good relationship with Africa countries. So maybe someday we will go outside. You know, just based on my previous presentation, you can see most Chinese scholars still focus on only China things, not outside of the world. Nowadays we have very few scholars who are doing environmental history in other countries. Like I told you last time, maybe some scholars are doing environmental history in Australia, in America, or something like this. But we just at the beginning. But because you see, for nowadays our government put big emphasis on environmental improvement. I think maybe this is a good opportunity for us to try to build a platform for future international connection in the study of environmental history. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Libby Robin. So I'm Libby Robin from Australia. And hi everybody. I've been thinking about what are the things we share here, not so much the things we don't share. So, for example, one of the things we bring is different environments to environmental history. And I'm always struck by the fact that the Journal of Global History has a spring and fall issue, which are out of sync with my spring and autumn. So we don't know that are exactly the same, and we have things we can compare. But one of the things we all seem to need to do is to compare with the known, and that's the US or Europe. So Dipesh Chakrabarty wrote about this 20 years ago in his book, Provincializing Europe. He said, I'm a historian of Bengal, and in order to talk about Bengal, I have to learn the history of Europe to explain to Europeans how Bengal fits into their worldview. And it's one of the ways of colonising and decolonising that is actually theoretically interesting, and that I think groups of us here, it's not just about getting jobs in universities, it's about a worldview. And I think the other thing that perhaps all of us peripherals share is a much stronger support for the intellectual work of environmental history outside universities. So public service departments, doing jobs for government to explain why mines are falling into rivers, that sort of thing is hugely important, and that's where the money's going to come from. There are no jobs in Australia in environmental history. We all speak English, so we haven't even got the problems you have in terms of relating to, but we still can't read everything that's ever written about Europe and everything that's ever written about the United States. It's really hard. But if we start looking at this conversation between the local and the global, and we make sure that the global isn't a conversation between the eastern states of America and the middle of Europe, which is kind of where it is at the moment, and people like Claudia and China and even Canada can, obviously you're not far away, but you can sort of just give us a little angle on things that makes room for a new place, perhaps Venezuela, who's never written anything in this area, to see, oh, I could come in there. And so the conversation actually has intellectual weight for everybody, because we all think we want to do things with Africa because that seems to be the area that needs help. But actually we all need to fit our local situation into what is increasingly being a nomadic, cosmopolitan global that doesn't ever touch the ground and doesn't do the work that we do, which is to look at the ecological context of human society. Just any comments would be great. And I'll pass it to Dan.
I've got a couple of things I could say to respond on that. I mean, those are important points, I think, to remember. And then for any colleagues who are trying to, internationalize their own work, environmental history is a field that I think lends itself well to that. I think about recent work done on comparative histories of parks, for example, or national parks around the world, where we've got a kind of core theme or issue that has different expressions globally, and there's some comparative possibilities. In my own field in urban environmental history, I think there's way more opportunities for international engagement around urbanization, largely because the environmental effects of urbanization are so similar globally, and there are big questions about why that is. And it would be great to see more work connecting North Americanists and Asianists and folks studying cities in Africa as well. And the other possibilities for internationalization from a Canadian context have to do with the geography that we study as Canadian historians. So we do a lot of international comparison with the United States, in part because of our proximity on the southern border, but on our northern borders, we also have efforts at internationalization for scholars of the Arctic who are studying a shared environment that is an international environment that crosses multiple borders between the nation states of the Arctic Circle. So those are some of the ways in which the thematic field of environmental history, I think, can lend itself to more international collaboration and comparative studies, and then our geographic context can help us bridge some connections.
Dan?
Sorry, Professor Hahn, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I just want to continue Shen's talk. Yeah, this July I'm going to take part in an international conference of comparatives of the big rivers in the world, which will be held at Duke University, Kunshan campus. Kunshan is a city close to Shanghai. I'm going to attend that meeting. My remark is, yeah, if we want to be really internationalized, firstly, we need to find the same topic. With the same topic, so we can do comparison with comparatives, which we can bring us together. Yeah.
Dan?
Okay.
Hello, Dan Tamir from the Ben Gurion University and the University of Zurich. Actually relating to what was said here before, maybe from a different angle, but much more related to an issue which came up here at the conference yesterday. And this is diversity within the association here in America. And the question which was raised quite, I would say even an emotional session, was a question of diversity within the membership and the activities and the scholar activity and the social aspects of this activity here in the United States and North America, with the local angle of gender, race, and other kinds of diversity. And my question is to, I think Wilko referred to it a little bit in the linguistic, in the language diversity of Europe. Just because it might also give an aspect for future work, how would you assess diversity in China and in South America? And Wilko, if you'd like to refer to it once again in the European, not only linguistic, but also other kinds of diversity. How would you see? Do you see there's a lack of diversity? Would you think that you'd like to have more diversity? Would you see it as a weak point, or maybe as a point of great strength for your relative regions?
Wilko, I don't know if you want to start. And you're muted.
Yeah, so there is a lot to do in Europe itself about increasing diversity in the different regional groups. Language only scraps the head of it. There are many topics that need to be approached. There is a lack of people of color in European environmental history, and there is a lack of involvement of migrants and refugees, and these are big questions that the universities need to face and things that need to be solved. The society can help, can try to help, and all committees and program committees I've met have been the most inclusive as possible. It is sometimes a question of funding, and I think this funding question is coming up again and again. That it's also a problem. Inclusivity and promoting diversity from this point of view is, especially in the German setting, a problem because of the limits of privacy. There are things we cannot ask, and the fact that there are things we cannot ask, we cannot know if we can. And there are things we cannot do. There is no affirmative action in the European setting. So it is a limit. And so beside saying that we are welcoming, there is not much that we can technically and physically do because of legislative limitations.
I think the situation in Canada is similar to the United States. I know at my own institution, we do have affirmative action hiring for the hiring of faculty members, but we don't in recruitment of graduate students. And so I think longer term for the development of the field, in the absence of affirmative action in terms of our recruitment for graduate students, it becomes difficult to try and diversify the PhDs and who are coming through. I was on a committee last summer evaluating applicants for fellowships, and part of the criteria that we were asked to evaluate was to seek out diverse graduate student applicants for this significant fellowship, but there was no data on the ethnic identity of the applicants, the gender of the applicants. So we were required to consider diversity in our adjudication, but were provided no information about the candidates themselves. And I said in the session, so we're supposed to be guessing based on their names. And so these are some real shortcomings at the graduate level for thinking about diversity if we want to try and change the face of the field in the future.
In the case of Solchem, I would say that unlike ASEH, we don't have a gender imbalance for some reason since the beginning. There have been a lot of women participating. As I mentioned before, Regina Horta Duarte, who's sitting among you, organized one of the first Solcha conferences. She created our journal, and like her, there have been others. Also men, like Reynaldo, who's in the back. So on that level, we're doing fine. But in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, we do have, serious issues. It would be a little bit hard to explain because we cannot use American racial categories to understand Latin America. And even within different countries, there are different issues. But still, there's a lot of relationship between race, ethnicity, and class, and privilege. And it, of course, infuses academia strongly. And it is an issue, and we know about it, and we're not doing anything about it, and we're not clear on what we can do about that. So yes, it is a big problem.
Thank you for that question. It also is helping me feel like more a part of the conference, because I know that this is a conversation that's going on across sessions.
Ling Zhang, Boston College. First of all, I want to thank everybody for raising all these wonderful questions. Really get me thinking. I'm a Chinese historian, and sitting in a conference, and I feel for many years the feeling is dominated. Of course, environmental history has always been American history, and also centered, and now gradually become more European history. But so it has been really, really hard. So actually, I don't really have a question, but it's really to share some personal experience, especially related to diversity issue. So I feel ASEH has been doing wonderful work, at least in terms of intention, working very hard to diversify. I actually participated working with Melissa and Sean for this year's conference program, and we try very hard to include scholars from outside the United States context. So for instance, the remote panel could take place, and the fact that a Chinese historian, medieval Chinese historian like me, was included in the program committee, I think it's a great gesture, great effort toward this diversification effort, the process. However, having all this said, I must say it's been really, really hard. When I look at the students' application, graduate student application, the abstracts, it's really out of balance. Students studying African history, environmental history, Asian environmental history, Latin American environmental history could not find people to form groups, to form panels. They had to submit individual papers. And we know historically, conventionally, we consider individual paper, we deem them as inferior. They don't have community. But actually, many of them are wonderful proposals. But because they don't have this racial, ethnic, international, intellectual niche in this society, so they always becomes loners. And in many years I've been coming to this conference. If you mark your panel as a China panel, nobody will come. If you say completely Asian panel, very few people will show up. I had many experiences, only 5 people sitting in the room. So I felt like this goes back to Claudia's wonderful is, what is the curiosity here? And especially when we put this issue into a majority-minority asymmetrical power issue relations here, I feel the majority need to take better interest, be more intellectually curious in what others, the small number of people, could actually offer. So that has to be a gesture from the majority of the members of the ASEH. This should not be a place only for them to, of course, it's important for them to network, to see old friends, but maybe reach out just as a gesture of a friendship and intellectual curiosity to make new friends with those people who seem fall apart and to be alone. That's my, simply just share some observation to echo with many issues we talked about here.
These are all really important points. I just want to kind of emphasize that. So having Ling on the program committee made a huge difference, not just for the gesture, but your views on the evaluation of the proposals that we looked at absolutely shaped the program. So that's something that's important for the association to remember, or the society to remember going forward, that, diversity on the program committee has an effect on the program and can help diversify the program. The second point is a great point about organized panels versus individual papers. Organized panels do get privileged, and in doing so, we privilege pre-existing networks, and it doesn't help develop new networks. So we may think about trying to reserve more space for individual papers and spreading out folks thematically into sessions so that we've got a Chinese history paper on a session about rivers, for example. And then another possibility is to create blocks of scheduling in the conference of sessions on China, Africa, South America, so that there's no choice. You have to go to a session that's outside of a US North American field. And we try to organize in a way a little bit more systematically. Sorry, Claudia, you wanted to get in.
No, it was a minor point to share regarding these people who are a bit lost, who present, students maybe who present a paper and don't find a community. Something that we've done in Solcha in previous ASEH and ESEH meetings, and even in the World Congress, is that we've had a room and we've called for a meeting, and we've very informally, shared who we are, what the society is doing, and that helps some of those people who might feel a bit lost to find a community within a community, within the larger community, to not feel so lost. And that's a small way in which our societies can help these other places like the one you're in right now.
Alan McEachran has the next question.
Wilko just wanted to add one more point. Yep.
Yeah, just one thing. It would be wonderful to have more individual papers. The problem is the panels that come out of individual papers, in my experience, are not very good, because the program committee has already a lot of work and trying to set up a panel that is significant. So those panels end up being the kind of panels in which people shop papers, and they come in and go out, and that's very disturbing. So what I've seen at the for the Society of the History of Technology, they have a system of open papers. So up to 10 days before the event, you can actually on the website of the society set up a panel, a tentative panel, and see if people will flock to your topic on the website. So this, I think, it's an improvement in respect to the sending out a call for papers on HNet and so on, because it is embedded in the society, and it's something that I want to propose for if I get re-elected as vice president for 2021, as a possibility to do for ESEH as well, because I think that it would help to create new communities, and not every panel needs to be a network that exists already, but it's nice if people make the effort to create a new community around the topic they want to do on that occasion. And also it's nice if we create communities that go beyond our own. It's not nice to have an only Italian panel, which would be what I would go to, but it's nice to have panels that go beyond the individual country. So it's not only China, but it goes beyond that area. So that was what I wanted to add.
Okay.
Alan McCaffrey here. I want to second Claudia. I really enjoyed the conversation we had recently, and I'm glad you mentioned the Rachel Carson Center as a way of bringing together people around the world. And it's been so successful. I think it's so important in bringing together environmental history internationally. But I also think sometimes that there's kind of a trickle-down theory of internationalization of environmental history, that it works at kind of the executive level, like the executive of SOLCHA and the executive of NICHE, for example. And it doesn't really, the theory is that we as executive members, if you will, help promote internationalization at a more member level. That really happens even, I think you can use examples of SOLCHA and NICHE that we haven't really partnered up in any way yet or haven't found reason to. And I guess what my question would be, I've been a member of ICEHO for a long time, and I've been encouraging internationalization. And I guess one of the things that I've been kind of curious about is it seems like the main gesture to internationalization has been World Congress, to meet every 5 years. People fly around the world and come to a single location and meet there. I guess I'm curious about if you think that there are more things we could be doing at a day-to-day level. And I think, for example, I take Karina's point about the fact that like NICHE cannot speed broadband, improve broadband for Africans on a kind of minute-by-minute connection basis, but NICHE could, for example, host an African environmental history network on our website and keep it there forever. It would be a safe spot. We could archive it, it could be there forever. Like, there are things we could be doing on a day-to-day level to help different environmental history networks around the world that are developing and to help them communicate. I'm wondering what you think we could be doing more on a day-to-day level.
So Claudia, did you want to respond first?
Well, the thing is, I don't really have an answer. So, so let me just, put together some thoughts that I think will not be satisfying. I think, Alan, your question, I think you're right. And this is kind of the question with affirmative action. If you have a few students who who are poor or who are Black and who are accepted into a university like mine, which is the elite university in Bogota, and they're able to make it, are you really changing the society, or are you just giving the opportunity to a few people, which is still, a good thing, but it's really not getting to, the underlying problem. And I think my response to this is a bit mixed. I think you've pointed out something very important. The fact that there's 3 Latin Americans in the room, well, 2 plus me remotely, doesn't mean that, Latin Americans are completely integrated. And Reynaldo, Regina, and me are Reynaldo, Regina, and me. We're not Latin America. We're individual people who are personally benefiting from, being part of it. And I think making that distinction is important. However, I do think that there is some trickle down effect. I think the fact that some of us have created these personal and not academic ties with other people are helping more and more. And just the strength of SOLCHA in general has helped bring non-Latin Americans to the SOLCHA meeting, because the SOLCHA is very different from NICHE and from ASEH and from ASEH. Latin Americans study Latin America. There are no Latin Americans studying Europe or studying in the US, maybe 1 or 2, but nobody that I can really think of. So, SOLCHA is not the Latin Americans who study the rest of the world and then the people in the rest of the world who study Latin Americans. It's the Latin Americans who study Latin Americans and those who are basically very, very few plus Americans who study Latin America. So I think SOLCHA, and I think the role of people like us, does help a little bit, or at least that's what I want to believe, in bringing other people to SOLCHA. So when our students from Costa Rica or Peru or Chile or wherever go to the SOLCHA meeting, they meet the professors from other part of the region, but they also meet, the guy who came from Denmark, and then the other one who came from Germany, the one and only one who came from Germany, and then a few who came from the US. And they have questions, of where they can do their graduate studies, maybe in other parts of Latin America, maybe in Spain, but maybe in Germany. And so they just jump to that person. And because SOLCHA has something very beautiful, which is this very kind of laid back atmosphere where everybody's kind of friends, and it's very easy in that setting to approach the professor rather than, be scared of dealing with the professor. Similarly, because precisely of this, I guess, executive group that has more opportunities, we're holding the next social school in Stanford, which has a lot of money. And we're going to be able to give scholarships to people who are coming from Latin America. And that would be yet another opportunity of course, a group of students to benefit of meeting, a wider array of professors that they wouldn't meet elsewhere. And those people are connected to the students of the previous social schools. And, we're not such a big community. So I do think that that kind of trickles down a bit. Students from other countries write to me saying, I want to study at the LMO, I want to study here, what should I do? And, as much as I can, I try to respond to all emails. So there is some sort of trickle down effect in that way. But I guess that your question really was another question, is what can we do on a daily basis? And I mean, what can we, maybe Americans, Canadians, what you can do rather than me? I'm not so sure.
Hi, my name is Marcus Hall. We're near the end of our session, and we have a fairly good turnout here today. A little bit disappointing, I think, considering how much work it was to put this all together. Melissa, of course, chose the program committee according to our so-called international reach, and I think we were pretty successful at doing that. And this is an experimental session, so I hope we can continue this and have one of these at least at an ESEH and an ASEH from here forward, for the simple reason of bringing people in and reminding us that you can also save on carbon footprints and bring in a lot of people from afar. Just to remind people, what time is it? Claudia and Sean, you're close to us. What time is it in Europe, Wilko?
It's 4 p.m. now.
Okay, and in China?
It's 5 to 10 in the evening.
Oh, okay. So reasonable time, not the middle of the night. The other issue is to remind you what's going on here at this conference, supposedly the biggest environmental history conference on the planet, which a lot of people come here to see what's going on. And so yesterday we had a really series of excellent talks on what is the future of environmental history. They brought in experts from different fields, and they all delivered excellent talks. But one thing in the global sciences and climate change, one on landscape architecture, another on art and the environment, and a third one on a local restoration ecologist, a very applied project. But what struck me is that all of these people, of course, are talking about, their worldview is very local, and that's fine, and it should be. But on the other hand, it's a reasonably international audience, so that all the examples and the worldview is all of the USA, and that just reminded me that all of us need to pose our questions, not so much by space, but by issue. And so that as you're writing your books and working on your topics, it's one that I always have to continually remind myself. And if someone is reading this from Eastern Europe, would they really be interested in this topic, or is this really a provincial topic? And it doesn't have to be an exceptional topic or unusual, but it has to have interest somehow to people overseas or in a different place. And so to develop a session, for example, around China or around Italy is not the best way to develop it, to frame a topic. It has to be about social justice or contamination in the watershed or something like that. So we've all seen those sessions where scholars come from amazing distances and then they're basically talking to themselves. So I think we're getting around that in the programs. So that's just a plea for developing our projects with this sort of idea and realization that there are people beyond our city and our country that might be reading our work, hopefully. A last note just on the terminology of societies for environmental history, which unfortunately have cropped up, and we talked about this in Europe several years ago, and clearly, and some societies have been fortunate in naming their society not according to region. So it's the Society for Environmental History with regional meetings or regional groups, and just the semantics of taking out the American or the European or the South American or the East Asian societies would go a long ways, I think, in including people into the global effort, the international effort of looking at humans and the environment at the time. And we can still have our regional meetings, but maybe it's too late to rename all of our societies and call it Society for Environmental History, and then have these regional groups. But anyway, those are just some thoughts as I listen to all this, and a plea that we can hopefully do this again in the future. And the last question to all of you is how were people selected? So we have sort of three, Colombia, China, and Germany, and Canada, but think of all of the others who we could have brought in here, but we didn't. And so it's mostly Sean who put this together, I think. Compliments, but then this is also itself a sample of what we could have done.
Thank you for that, Marcus. Yeah, you're right. This was designed to be a showcase for what we can do, and the topic that we chose for the session also lent itself to discussion about internationalization. So hopefully this was helpful for people who came to the audience. I'm cognizant of the time, not just in Columbus, but in China as well, as it's getting late. But I wanted to close off just by thanking all of the panelists who participated in this experimental session. We did some test runs ahead of time to make sure that the technology would work. And I'm really grateful for the patience and time that everyone put into this. And grateful to Melissa for helping coordinate the logistics on the ground in Columbus for the session. So just a round of applause for all the participants here this morning. And if I could ask a favor from someone in the audience, if somebody could just take a picture of us and post it on Twitter, just so that other people can see what we look like, and so that we can see what we look like, because we have no idea how it looks to you.
Oh, I can send you the photo.
Thank you.
I would like to point out, would the members of the program committee stand up so you can see that our program committee was actually fairly international. So, and Sean isn't going to stand up, but we have two other people on the program committee that are not here who are.
Oh, and it looks like we lost Melissa. Yeah. There, she's back. Okay. Sorry, Melissa, you cut out for a second.
Well, that's all right.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for coming out to this experimental session. It was great.
Thank you, Xia.
And Claudia and Zhaoqing and Wilko, thank you so much. I'll let everyone get going, and I'll post the video as soon as I get it edited.
Zhaoqing, 晚安。
晚安。
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Columbus.
Hey, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Claudia.
Bye.